All right. Thank you all. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Rodney Dawson. I'm the curator of education at the Greensboro History Museum, and we welcome your participation in tonight's webinar series, Holocaust Education. Tonight's installment is Sound of Hope, Music as Solace and Resistance During the Holocaust. Today's conversation is made possible in part by the Greensboro History Museum Incorporated, the City of Greensboro, and the Libraries Department. Any views, findings, or recommendations expressed in today's program do not necessarily reflect those aforementioned entities. And if you take the time to view the bottom of your screen now, you'll see the Q&A icon. By selecting this option, you can type in questions for our panelists. Once you've typed in your question, hit the enter button on your keyboard to submit. We have reserved the latter part of our program to field those questions. This evening, we welcome our panelists for the webinar, which will also be featured as an archive in our History Notes podcast section at a later date. However, it will be immediately made available on the Greensboro History Museum's YouTube channel. At your convenience, please visit www.greensborohistory.org. Select the Discover and Learn tab to hear the podcast when available. But as mentioned, for more immediate viewing, go to our YouTube channel, and that icon is also on our history page. Tonight's panelist is Dr. Kellie Brown. She's the music department chair and professor at Milligan University, and author of the book bearing the title of our webinar, Sound of Hope, Music as Solace and Resistance During the Holocaust. Good evening, Dr. Brown from Eastern Tennessee, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Rodney. Good evening to you and to everyone watching, and thank you to the Greensboro History Museum for having me as part of this important Holocaust webinar series. So in 2003, which doesn't seem that long ago until you start doing the math and you're like, wow, that was almost 17 years ago. I read a biography of Alma Rosé, who was an internationally renowned violinist who was sent to Auschwitz. And it changed the course of my life reading this book. And I began to research music's role in the Holocaust. And I came to know the stories of remarkable people, composers and conductors and musicians who stubbornly clung to music whenever and however they could to preserve their culture, to uplift the human spirit, and to triumph over oppression, even amid incredible suffering and tragedy. And I also came to know in my research that while an individual book might have been written about a person or a single memoir, that this connection that I was seeing between their stories that resounded through the power of music had not been fully made. And that's how my book, The Sound of Hope, came to be. And for me, the process was almost like the making of a quilt, and that each story was like sewing in a panel, and it made the quilt just more beautiful and stronger all of the way. As we were talking about before we started the webinar, I never expected that my book would release during a global pandemic, but it did this summer when we were all realizing that this virus was going to be with us longer than we thought it might be back in the spring. And I'm so grateful for readers who found the stories of the resilience and hope contained in my book to be meaningful to them during this challenging time. The book is organized in a narrative structure. It is history told as story. And the stories of individuals are told alongside the stories of places, so cities and camps and ghettos and concert halls, because their stories are braided together, that they're inseparable. And I knew right away that the title of the book had to have the word hope in it, because hope is such a powerful thing. The great American poet Mary Oliver was contemplating what is the antidote to the darkness in our world. What is the countering force to darkness? And she finally decided on hope. And the reason she decided on hope is she said that hope is a fighter. Another one of my favorite poets is Emily Dickinson, who's wrote a really meaningful poem about hope. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. So that poem begins to connect the concept of hope and music together. And the reason they're so compatible is because, like hope, music is incredibly powerful. The 19th century French novelist Victor Hugo said it this way: music expresses that which cannot be put into words, and that which cannot remain silent. And of course, this power can be used in positive or in destructive ways. And so for the next few minutes together, I want to talk about the ways in which music during the Holocaust provided solace and sometimes salvation, and how it simultaneously was a tool for spiritual resistance and also an agent of resilience. Herbert Zipper was born in Vienna. He was a musically gifted child. He studied piano from a young age. By the time he got to university age, he knew that conducting was really the path that he wanted to go down. And in his 20s, he fell in love with a beautiful and talented dancer named Trudel. And she was as gifted as he was. And so their careers continued to keep them apart geographically and delay their marriage. But their story together sort of parallels how music worked for them throughout the Holocaust. So Herbert ends up taking a conducting job in Dusseldorf, Germany. He was really successful there. He had a wonderful mentor who knew a lot of famous people. So Herbert would go to dinner at his house, and famous people would show up. Albert Schweitzer, Igor Stravinsky, Paul Hindemith. These were the kinds of people that Herbert got to know. But with the Nazi rise to power, then Herbert's Jewish ancestry, made him a target of anti-Semitism and death threats, and he eventually had to flee back to Vienna. But Vienna was not safe either because the Nazis annexed it, and so Herbert was arrested by the Gestapo, and he was sent to Dachau. Crammed into a cattle car on the way to Dachau, Herbert formulated a twofold plan about how he was going to survive. The first thing he decided is that he refused to live in fear. And the second thing is that he rededicated himself to the act and practice of generosity. And so music became part of his plan. When he first arrived, the guards were tormenting prisoners by forcing them to sing, making them pretend they were happy to be in this concentration camp. When it became Herbert Zipper's turn, he wholeheartedly just belted out Beethoven's Ode to Joy with its message that declared this universal brotherhood of all mankind. The guards assigned Herbert to be a human pack horse. He had to carry on his back heavy bags of cement all over the camp. But instead of letting this sink him into despair or into great hatred, he chose to see this work as an opportunity to meet fellow prisoners, to bring them a kind word or recite them a poem or sing a song. He wanted to bring something beautiful to this place of such ugliness. He eventually assembled a group of musicians, and they began to give secret concerts in an unused latrine for the prisoners. And these concerts did so much to lift the spirits of those prisoners who were suffering, and it helped to restore some of the humanity that had been stripped from them. One day, Herbert was walking out around in the camp near this gate with his friend, a playwright, Ura Zofor, who he had known before the war. And they decided that they were going to write a song, a parody of this infamous phrase on the gate, Arbeit macht frei, work will set you free. These words were a mockery to the prisoners because, there was no true path to freedom. And they did. And this is what came from that. It's called Dachau Lied or Dachau Song. And Herbert began to teach it to the prisoners in the camp. And soon it spread not only through Dachau's camp, but to other camps as prisoners were transferred throughout the system. It really became a great rallying cry for resistance. So I'm going to play just a little bit of Dachau Song. Soon after Herbert and Ura wrote this song, they were transferred to Buchenwald camp, where conditions were even worse. They ended up being assigned to clean the latrine that prisoners with typhus used. And Ura contracted typhus, and he died in 1939. Miraculously, that same year, Herbert's father was able to secure his release, something that was rare and wouldn't have happened very likely in the 40s. But meanwhile, Herbert's fiancée, Trudel, had accepted a position to head up a dance department in the Philippines at the university there. And then another wonderful event happened. Their orchestra, the Manila Symphony, had an opening for a conductor. And so Herbert got that job and went to the Philippines and was with Trudel. And so finally, after a 12-year courtship, these two were married and an elaborate wedding there in Manila. And so Herbert did wonderful work there with the symphony for 2 years, but then war came to the Pacific and things were really bad for the Philippines. Herbert, who was incredibly wise, decided to hide all of the orchestra's instruments and music. And he wanted to protect it for what could happen after the war. And so he and Trudel kind of hunkered down and tried to do what they could for the people there. And the Japanese arrested Herbert, and he was in jail for a period of time. And after his release, he began to work with the Americans in an underground resistance group. And he also developed a grand musical plan. His plan was that as soon as the Nazis were defeated and the Philippines were free, that he was going to stage an elaborate concert, that he was going to reassemble the Manila Symphony, and they were going to perform Beethoven's Third Symphony, the Heroic Symphony. So in the spring of 1945, as fighting was dying down, Herbert appealed to the U.S. Army. He actually went directly to General MacArthur and said, here's a list of the things I need. Music needs to be brought to these people for healing. And he was very persuasive because General MacArthur gave him everything that he asked for. And so Herbert began to find surviving orchestra members. He was able to get extra rations of food for them because many were so malnourished. And on May 9th, 1945, they staged this concert. And once the U.S. Army saw how powerful that concert was and how it was affecting people, they asked Herbert if he would continue to give weekly concerts for the next 52 weeks, which he did. And he and Trudel eventually immigrated to the United States, and he began to conduct throughout the country. But he also began to focus that spirit of generosity that he had on bringing educational concerts to underserved children. In 1988, Herbert Zipper returned to Austria, his birthplace, and conducted a 50th anniversary performance of his Dachau song. Even at age 91, 2 years before his death, Herbert was still enthusiastically and generously bringing music to people. Alma Rosé grew up in Vienna at the same time as Herbert Zipper. They were contemporaries. The main difference between Alma and Herbert was that Alma was born into musical royalty. Alma's uncle was the great composer Gustav Mahler. And this is Alma's mother, Justine, who was his sister. Alma's father, Arnold Rosé, was one of the most famous violinists of the time. He was the concertmaster of the Vienna Philharmonic and the Vienna Opera Orchestra, positions he held for over 50 years. He also taught at the prestigious Vienna Conservatory, and he founded the Rosé String Quartet, which was one of the finest string quartets at the time. So Alma lived a very privileged life as her family hobnobbed with the socially elite of Vienna. Regular visitors to her home were like a who's who of the musical world. It wouldn't be surprising for Alma to walk into their sitting room, and there would be Arturo Toscanini or Richard Strauss, these really famous musical figures. She began to study the violin with her father when she was 5 years old. Both of them were very serious about cultivating her musical talent. Her father would not permit her to play any sports or games that might injure her hands. And by the time she was 12, she was practicing 6 hours a day, which is a lot of practice for a 12-year-old. And she was admitted into the Vienna Conservatory. And by the early 1930s, she had this successful performing career. But all of that ended, just like for Herbert Zipper, with the annexation of Austria. Her entire family was banned from performing, and her father was fired from the orchestras and the conservatory. She and her father were eventually able to flee to England. And this photo here is in a 1939 English newspaper that announced the arrival of these famous people. But when they arrived, they were penniless. They had to leave everything behind. And Alma was offered some performing work in Holland, and they desperately needed the money. And she thought that Holland would probably be a safe place, so she went there. And while she was there performing, the Nazis invaded Holland, and she was trapped. And she tried hiding, but she knew that she was going to be arrested. So she decided to escape, or try to escape, to Switzerland. But she was captured by the Gestapo, and she was sent to Auschwitz. Alma started out in Block 10, which was the experimental medical block, where Dr. Joseph Mengele and others did horrific experiments. When she got inside there and looked around, she asked for a violin. She said for someone to bring her a violin because she was sure that her life was about to be over, and she wanted the solace of her music. And due to her reputation, she did succeed in getting a violin brought to her. And she began to give nightly concerts in the medical block for the poor women there. And this actually saved her because the prisoners who were working in that office kept her name off the lists for the upcoming experiments. But it wasn't long until her presence got the notice of Maria Mandel, who was the head of the women's camp in Birkenau, the sub-camp of Auschwitz. And Mandel had Alma transferred to Block 12, which was the music block. And that is when Alma realized that there was an orchestra in Auschwitz. But an orchestra of prisoners was not a rare thing. Many of the camps had them. Auschwitz had 3 of them, 2 men's orchestras and the only women's orchestra in the whole camp system. This was forced music labor, prisoners being forced to make music, to play in ensembles. And you think, why would that be happening in a concentration camp? Well, there are many reasons. One is the Germans had a great love for music. They also understood the power of music, and they wanted to be able to wield that power. The orchestra duties mostly consisted of playing marching music in the morning and the evening for the prisoners to march back and forth to their work details. But they were also on call day and night to perform any music that the SS might want to hear. They gave concerts for the SS and sometimes concerts for prisoners as well. One of the things we see through this is just one of the great dissonances of the Nazi mindset, that the guards could so callously murder people, then sit teary-eyed listening to their favorite music being played. In this drawing by a prisoner, you can see the orchestra having to play while the other prisoners march back from their work in the evening. I assume that this is an evening march because some of them are so exhausted that they are having to be carried. You can imagine that playing in the orchestra while the other prisoners marched to work did not make the orchestra members very popular among their fellow captives, who sometimes considered them collaborators and hurled insults at them. These musicians, of course, had no choice: play or be killed. In his memoir after the war, Dr. Primo Levi, who was an Italian Jewish chemist sent to Auschwitz, said that it was the sound of this music for marching to work that would forever represent the camp to him. Alma was forced to become the conductor of the women's orchestra, which was mostly made up of amateur musicians and not your typical group of instruments you would expect to see in an orchestra. There were guitars and mandolins alongside violins and other orchestral instruments. And what she realized early on is that she could save lives, because as long as the Nazis wanted this orchestra, which they did, that she had some leverage that she could use to get things like extra food rations or a stove for the barracks. I mean, conditions were still so hard and miserable, but she did what she could to help them and to get as many women in the orchestra as she could to save them. And she worked incredibly hard to help the orchestra improve its quality, because she knew that was also essential to saving their lives. And she wrote arrangements of music for them. Sometimes she would stay up all night to write something new for them to play. And eventually they had a repertoire of over 200, pieces. It was truly amazing. One of the women that Alma saved was Anita. Anita was sent to Auschwitz when she was 17 years old. When she was going through that horrific intake procedure where they were shaving her head and tattooing a number, the prisoner who was doing that kind of work asked her what she did before the war. And Anita said, "I played the cello." And then she received a response that she hadn't counted on. This person said, "Fabulous, you'll be saved." And she was told to wait. And so she was standing to the side, naked, with her head shaved. And she said after a time, she saw this elegant woman coming toward her. The woman was a prisoner, but had a certain regal air about her. And the woman said, "My name is Alma Rosé. And do you indeed play the cello?" And Anita said, "Yes, I do." And she said, "Well, you will be in my orchestra." And this was an invitation to life for Anita. And it wasn't the first time that the cello saved her life. After she was in the orchestra for a little while, she got sick and she was in the camp hospital. And the guards would walk through the camp hospital and look and see who they thought was the sickest, and they would send them on to the gas chamber. And one of the guards said, "How about her? She looks really sick." But the other guard said, "Isn't that the only cellist we have in the orchestra?" And so because of that, they passed by her. Dr. Mengele took a special liking to Anita's cello music. And on at least one occasion, he came into their barracks and asked her to play for him. He had asked her to play the Schumann Traumerei. So imagine this beautiful piece of music juxtaposed on top of such hatred. Anita survived the war, and she's still with us today. She's 95 years old, and she still remains very active in giving her testimony on behalf of those who died and those who survived. But surviving is not easy. There is an incredible weariness that comes from the responsibility to bear witness for so many years. When she speaks, I can hear the strain in her voice. I can see it on her face for having to do this for over 75 years. Her entire life has been defined by what happened to her when she was 17 years old. And surviving from the camp orchestra was also hard because of the difficulty of reconciling their role in the Nazi machinery of the camp, a special kind of survivor's guilt. And this is what Anita says about that. "We played with tears in our eyes and guns in our backs." While Alma Rosé was able to save so many women like Anita, she herself did not survive the war. She died in Auschwitz on April 5th, 1944. May her memory be a blessing. I have one more story to share. There's so much about Alice's life that mirrors that of Alma's. Alice was born into a wealthy and influential family in Prague. Her mother was a talented pianist, a well-educated woman. Her father was a successful businessman. He was one of the first people in Prague to own an automobile. Alice was a child prodigy. She was so gifted at the piano, like Alma was at the violin. And in the 1930s, she was making a name for herself in the musical world, just like the other two people that we've looked at, Herbert Zipper and Alma Rosé. In the spring of 1931, Alice married the love of her life, Leopold Sommer, and a few years later, they welcomed their son, Rafi. And also like Alma's beloved Vienna, Alice's Prague was overtaken by the Nazis when they invaded Czechoslovakia. And then in 1943, the same year that Alma was sent to Auschwitz, Alice and her mother and her husband and her 6-year-old son were sent to Terezin. Known in Czech as Terezin or in German as Theresienstadt, this ghetto, as it was officially called, was located about 30 kilometers outside of Prague. And even though it was technically labeled a ghetto, it functioned as a concentration camp. The Nazis used this camp to house a lot of artists and intelligentsia from Prague. And they were subject to these horrific conditions of overcrowding and hunger and disease and just every deprivation that you can imagine. They also lived in this daily fear of deportation because Terezin also functioned as a transit camp. And so there were trains regularly departing, carrying prisoners to extermination camps, particularly Treblinka and Auschwitz. Because of the population that the Nazis were sending to Terezin, many prominent composers and conductors and performers like Alice ended up being there. And the prisoners themselves organized musical activities, which is different than what we see in some of the other camps where they were forced to make music. But at first, music in Terezin was forbidden and it had to be done in secret. There was one cellist who, when he found out he was being deported to Terezin, he took his cello apart and he hid the pieces in the clothing of his luggage. And he also brought some glue. And when he got inside the camp, he glued his cello back together. That's how much music meant to them. But in time, the Nazis began to allow and even encourage music making because they found that they could use it for propaganda purposes, to convince the rest of the world about how well the Jews were being treated. And they even used music successfully to fool some of the representatives from the Red Cross who came to inspect the camp. And there are so many amazing musical performances that took place in Terezin. Performances of operas like Mozart's Magic Flute, or oratorios like Mendelssohn's Elijah. There were 4 orchestras in Terezin and chamber music and so many solo recitals. And so when Alice arrived in Terezin, she became an important musical figure there. She gave over 100 piano recitals, all from memory. And she also gave special music programs for the children. And educating children in any way was forbidden, but Alice began to give the children piano lessons in secret. And it's so much Alice's piano playing that people remembered, that survivors remembered as lifting their spirits. So one of the things that she did is she played a lot of Chopin etudes. So imagine again being in this ugly place and hearing this beautiful music. Another talented pianist and composer who was in Terezin was Hans Krause. He was really an internationally known composer. He was known in the United States because the Boston Symphony had performed one of his symphonies in the 1920s. Krasse will be most remembered, though, for a children's opera that he composed called Brundibar. Krasse had composed this children's opera in the late 1930s, and it was performed in a Jewish orphanage. When Krasse was deported to Terezin, he saw how many children were there, and he decided to stage a production to give the children something to work on, to get their minds on. This opera is a moral fairy tale. It is the story of two small children who are mistreated by an evil organ grinder named Brundibar. And with the help of three kindly animals, a sparrow, a cat, and a dog, and the other children in the village, this evil Brundibar is eventually banished from the village. This children's opera was performed an amazing 55 times by the children in the camp. Alice's son, Rafi, played the role of the sparrow and is pictured here on the far left, standing on the box. He was 6 years old and the youngest member of the cast. There was no doubt for those prisoners who were watching this production that evil organ grinder represented Hitler. I mean, look at the mustache. And they understood the symbolism of this victory and what they were singing and what this meant, the eventual triumph of good over evil. And the few final lines of this opera really demonstrate the intent and the spirit of this story. He who loves justice and will abide by it, and who is not afraid, is our friend and can play with us. Tragically, almost every child performer and audience member was murdered in Auschwitz, including the composer, Hans Krasse. One of the few children who did survive was 13-year-old Ella Stein, who played the cat. When asked after the war what it meant to her and the other children to sing together in the face of this suffering, she said, "When we were singing, we forgot all our troubles. It was possible to have hope." I think that what the prisoners at Terezin had discovered was the truth that Alice stated when people asked her how they could have continued to make music in such horrific conditions. Alice would say, "Music was life. We did not, could not, would not give up." It is important to note that music did not bring comfort to everyone. For some, it had the opposite effect. The thing that was most precious to them would be used as a weapon. And some who survived could never play music again. The joy of that gift had been stolen from them. One violinist in Auschwitz was forced to play the French national anthem while the Nazis were hanging a French prisoner. And afterwards, for several days, he just could not resign himself to having had his music used in that horrific way. And he committed suicide. Alice and Rafi did survive the war. Unfortunately, so tragically, her mother and her husband did not. Alice and Rafi survived because of her music. One night while they were still in the camp, a young German guard came up to her and said, "I love your music and I listen to you play from outside the window, and I have made sure that you and your son have not gone on the deportation list. So after their liberation, Alice and Rafi returned home to Prague, and Alice focused on nurturing his incredible music talent. But Prague never felt like home to them again. The Soviet Union had taken over, and Alice felt like that they had exchanged one tyranny for another, and anti-Semitism was still rampant there. And so in 1949, she and Rafi immigrated to Israel, and she took a job there teaching at the Jewish Academy of Music. Rafi eventually became an internationally renowned cellist. And Alice not only survived, but she thrived. She was still practicing the piano 3 hours a day when she turned 100 years old. Upon her death in 2014, Alice was 110 years old, the oldest known Holocaust survivor. May her memory be a blessing. I believe that Alice had learned the same truth that Viktor Frankl wrote about in his post-war memoir, Man's Search for Meaning. Between stimulus and response, there is space. In that space lies our freedom and power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and freedom. So we have a choice, maybe not about what happens to us, but about how we respond to it. I'm choosing to respond to what I've learned about music and the Holocaust by continuing to bear witness to these stories. At some point soon, the last person on earth who lived through the Holocaust will pass. And with them, this collective visceral memory that they have held in trust for society will also pass. And I believe that music specifically is one of the most accessible ways to tell these stories. I would even suggest that music is the living artifact because music functions as a mirror. It's a mirror of the time in which it was written and performed. And so it allows the spiritual essence of music, of the people, of the time, to be recreated again with intensity and with relevance. And so I would say to us today that we need to keep naming the names of the dead, not just to keep their memories alive, but also to impact the way that the living are interacting with the world, to set the moral compass toward racial and social justice. We need their testimony as a reminder for our world of what hate and prejudice can lead to. And we also need these stories to tell us how vital the arts remain in understanding the human condition and in spreading peace and goodness on a global scale. Everyone who met Alice came away in awe of her perpetual optimism in spite of all that had happened to her. So I'll leave you with one of my favorite quotes, and then I'm happy to answer questions. Life is beautiful. You have to be thankful that we are living. Wherever you look is beauty. I know about the bad things, but I look for the good things.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. I had to go off camera for a second because I was taking notes. So I took your class for free.
Okay.
But it did lead me to a question that someone asked, and it was a question of mine. Do you perform any of the pieces that you showcased tonight, or have you performed them?
Yes, maybe not the Chopin Etude. I'm a violinist and violist and conductor, and I've certainly played music that was played in the camps. I did a concert a couple years ago at Appalachian State. They had a conference, an international symposium really on Holocaust museum music, and I organized a concert of the pieces that were played in Auschwitz, and I performed some of them.
And I'm wondering if you personally perform what you've answered, or if you've had your orchestra work on any of these pieces. But knowing the history behind it, does it affect you when you plan it, or does it hold a special meaning to you?
It really does. I'm not able to separate that music from the stories, from the deep connections I have with it now, and I'm glad. And it's going to be something that I'm planning for next semester for my orchestra here at Milligan. We are going to be doing some Holocaust kind of memorial music and some things played in the camps, and I'm looking forward to giving my students that opportunity to make that kind of important, deep connection.
Okay. And I want to encourage folks to go into the Q&A at the bottom, and I'm going to enable the chat box. We're going to ask a question, and anyone, the first person to answer that question before we get out of here is going to win a copy of your book. But one of the questions that's been raised is, can you please give the title of the book that inspired you? The reason this question is asked, the person has set up a Holocaust Education lending library in Eastern North Carolina, and will love to purchase it, as well as your book, of course. So is there a book that's inspired you?
The first book that I mentioned that I read is the biography of Alma Rose, From Vienna to Auschwitz by Richard Newman.
Okay. All right, by Richard Newman. So I hope our listener, our viewer got that. Follow-up question would be, Playing for a Time. This is a question about a movie that came out.
Yes.
But Playing for a Time was a popular film about the musicians in Auschwitz. And he's read the portrayal of the musicians was very incorrect, according to the musicians that survived. Did the accuracy or inaccuracy of the film ever come up in your research? And he believes the film was based on the autobiography of one of the musicians, and assumes the autobiography may have also faced questions of historical accuracy. And he's seen the film used in classrooms. And so this is what prompts his question.
Yes, and I do spend a pretty good amount of time in my book talking about Playing for Time, talking about the controversy surrounding it. So it is an issue. One of the survivors from the orchestra, and she happened to be the first person to write a book about her memoir. And when you're the first person to sort of write, it kind of establishes it as, the historical record. But there were some of the things that she said in her book, particularly about Alma Rose. She said some very disparaging things about Alma Rose. And the other survivors from the orchestra contradicted that in their memoirs, and were upset with what they saw as some inaccuracies. But her book was turned into a play by Miller, and then it became this film in 1980. And so there has been some concern about it. I think it's an important a book to consider. I think we always need to consider that this author, Fania Fenelon, suffered greatly in the camps. But we have to look at a lot of other sources in addition, and it wouldn't be one that I would go to first as the primary historical record.
Okay. And the same person that posed this question says that he heard you perform at Appalachian State.
Oh, okay, great.
And it led him to include more music into his classroom exercise. And speaking of classrooms, how do your students receive this?
It's a very difficult subject, and I try to create a space in which, they can be emotional. They can react to these stories however they need to react. And sometimes I break down and I'm emotional, and we just know that that's sometimes our response. And I've been really pleased with how year after year students seem to really connect. These music students I teach connect these stories, and they think about their own lives, and they've just received it so very well. And I think it's something that stays with them, because I hear from them later and they say, I still remember you talking about Alma Rose, and they'll send me things that they hear in the news. Like, I thought you'd be interested in this. So I think it stays with them maybe more than some of the other facts that we cover in music history.
Okay, and forgive me, I might butcher the name, but the very first piece where you played the lyrics to the song, is that pronounced Doc Al-Lead or Doc Al-Lied?
Doc Al-Lead, Doc Al
Right.
song.
I get an A.
You did it.
All right, and I'm listening to the lyrics. I'm watching the lyrics as you display them, but I'm listening to. It's almost not happiness is the wrong word, but I see a forcefulness in how it was sung.
Yes.
That's a great juxtaposition. You know, the words are saddening and outright just can take you there, but how it was displayed. Explain that juxtaposition. You know, how did those two dynamics converge?
Yeah, so the way the melody and the rhythm and the beat is structured, there's this kind of a march-like beat, but there's this sense of defiance about it. You know, we're singing these words, we're in this place, but we're going to sing it in solidarity and defiance together. And there's something that happens when people lift their voices together in song. There is power there. It creates a collective unity that very few things can do in the way that collective corporate song can.
Okay. And do your students pick up on that as you teach it to them, or do they have that same keep that same melodic sense, but yet have that determination that is played with?
Yes, I think they do. And, you know, my students are taught to listen very critically to music and try to listen to music contextually. You want to listen to music knowing what was going on in society during that time, because music's, of course, not written in isolation. It reflects the times. And so that's a really great example of them being able to listen critically and contextually.
Okay, and I remind you, we got a few moments left, but we have time to take your questions. So just go to the Q&A at the bottom of your screen and type them in. We'll get them answered live while we have time, while we have Dr. Brown here. One question coming from Madeline Reed: did the musicians recreate the music onto paper and then distribute it amongst the other musicians, or did they have the music with them somehow?
Well, if we're thinking about the women's orchestra in Auschwitz, because of the unusual instrumentation, you know, there was no music that was written for that group of instruments that would have, you know, mandolins and guitars and things. So Alma Rosé would write the arrangements. What the survivors say is they didn't have printed music paper, but they would get paper and draw the lines on it for the musical staff and write in the parts. In Terezin, there was more access to actual printed music, and sometimes they would smuggle in the actual printed parts. Some composers wrote new pieces within the camps, and those would be written down and notated on whatever scraps of paper that they could find.
Okay, we have time for a couple more questions, then we're going to do a quick giveaway and then sign out. But I do have one, so we got time for you to type in one more. Do you have a baby? Do you have a favorite? If so, what is it?
Say that one more time. What
favorite piece that you performed or you've worked on, maybe not performed, that you'll just, do you have a favorite piece?
Well, as a string player, I'm really partial to the string repertoire for sure. And I certainly love a piece called the Chardas, which is something that we know that Alma Rosé played as a solo in the camp.
Okay, and one last question. You talked about how insults were hurled at the orchestra members by fellow captives, and yet they had to face the oppression of the guards and just the living conditions of being in the camp. How do you see that? How can you explain how they were able to persevere and move on?
Yeah, there's just such great resilience in their lives that I see, and in their stories, such great strength, and they did. So many of them had this kind of hope. They held on to hope because that was powerful. And the hope that maybe this would end, and the hope that maybe we will get out, and that maybe we will survive, and just, living from one moment to the next. And so many of them, did survive, but so many did not.
Okay. Well, I've learned, I always learn in our webinars, but I particularly learned at this one. And so we just really appreciate you taking the time to help us and to teach us and to make us aware. I mean, we did our podcast, which is available on our website, but I never knew there was an orchestra in concentration camps. And I never knew that it was used as solace and resistance at the same time. So speaking of that, we want to give away a copy of your book, The Sound of Hope. And I'm going to ask a question, and I'm going to ask everyone to look down at your chat feature. I'm only going to be able to look at one. So look at your chat feature. Let me let me make sure I can enable this thing first. Okay. So it's enabled. It's enabled. I'm going to make this for all panelists and attendees. So anyone can answer. Go on your chat feature. First one to answer this question, I have your email address because you registered. What I'll do is I'm going to email you and get your address, and then I'll mail this book to you. But the first one to answer it correctly. And here's the question. It's from content that Dr. Brown discussed earlier. May 9th, 1945, Herbert Zipper staged his first concert at the close of World War II in what country? So on May 9th, 1945, Herbert Zipper staged his first concert at the close of World War II in what country? And you can type your answer.
You've got a correct response there.
I do. Was that from Madeline? I think it is.
I think there was one more, I think, maybe before.
Let me see what got first here. I believe it was from Miss Reed. We got it from Miss Reed. All right. So I'll look up and get your email address, and then I'll email you. You can just send me your address. And congratulations, but it was the Philippines. All right. Dr. Brown, any closing remarks?
I just want to thank you again, Rodney, for having me in the Greensboro History Museum. And thank you to all the viewers, and blessings to everyone.
Yes, and hey, thank you. Just like I always say, this is time well spent. Congratulations to Madeline. We'll get that out to you. If for whatever reason I don't have your email address, Madeline, I'm rodney.dawson@greensboro-nc.gov, or just give us a call. But I want to make sure I get your address. But thank you for joining us tonight. This is the first installment of the Holocaust Education, Part 1, Sound of Hope, Music as Solace and Resistance During the Holocaust. Book came out in June, and I don't know how many book Zooms you've done, but I'm sure you're exhausted. But it's a 3-part series, so we have part 2 next week. We're talking with Elizabeth Rosner. Part 2 is Transgenerational Wounds and Resiliency, How the Past Shapes Our Future. Our guest is Elizabeth Rosner, whose work has been called Breathtaking by Pulitzer Prize winning novelist Viet Nguyen, and named by the San Francisco Chronicle as one of the best books of the year. She's the daughter of Holocaust survivors and author of Survivor Cafe, The Legacy of Trauma, and The Labyrinth of Memory. Did I say that right? Labyrinth, is that okay? I'm learning today. Attendance is free. However, don't forget to register. Go to greensborohistory.org or the Greensboro History Museum Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter platforms to learn more. And just thank you very much. We appreciate you. Don't be a stranger. Call us when your next book comes out too.
All right, I will.
All right, and thank you to the wonderful audience. We only do this for you. We couldn't do it without you. So we really appreciate